They've saved the best till last, and we're actually trying to do a panel discussion today around a collaborative project that Circularise is running with our customers. And my name is Dr. Phil Brown. I've basically the last few years been researching collaborative innovation for a circular economy. Been trying to look at how do you connect actors at different ends of the value chain to create circular innovation projects. And we have a live example here, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our team. I would like each member to just quickly introduce themselves in one sentence, the company they work for, and also the position that they have. So, Juergen, can I pass to you?
Juergen Henschel, General Manager and Director of Underwriters Laboratories for Engineered Materials in Europe.
Mesbah Sabur, I'm not the moderator, Phil is the moderator. I'm one of the founders of Circularise. And Circularise is a transparency solution for the global supply chain.
John Fox from Covestro, and specialized in innovation and digital solutions.
Antoon, Versteeg, Porsche, innovation management, innovation research.
And Thomas Nuyts, global product manager at Domo Chemicals, a leading polyamide supplier.
So with the collective group that we have today, we have a group of material providers as well as brands, and also a certification body. And one of the key insights that came from my own research was really, when taking on a circular economy approach, how you need to take an ecosystem perspective. So the problem within this is moving away from an engagement with just one or two tiers down, but really taking on a systemic approach. So within that aspect of the problem, one of the key challenges that I identified when trying to connect actors is a lack of data transparency. Many good ideas can fall flat when you don't have the correct information to make decisions. So firstly, I would like to ask Antoon, how do you think we can change how businesses and value chains work together to produce circular innovation? And what is Porsche's approach?
Yeah, thank you. So I think very important to know, I guess, is that we all know Porsches. They are cars with many thousands of parts and many thousands of suppliers, a very complex supply chain. And I think one of the things we have realized over the past few years is that the requirements from the governments, requirements from also our customers are becoming increasingly, well, they want to know more about the parts, they want to know more about the heritage of the part, where it's coming from, the provenance. And that's actually a massive challenge, like how do we provide that? Because to some extent we get a lot of information, but let's say how can we maybe even give a customer a tool, a way to get access to information about the vehicle that currently is maybe hiding somewhere in the mailbox of a procurement colleague. And I think that's a very interesting challenge, because it means that to actually change it, we all need to be part of the solution.
Thank you, Antoon. And with that, obviously, Antoon mentioned the need to collect data from upstream. So we do have John, obviously one of the providers of materials. John, could you give an example from yourself of the challenge in the way that you're looking at redefining the business and the relationships that you're doing for circular economy?
I'm sure what we see from a foundational perspective is regarding transparency. So the ability for our company, for Covestro, for anyone along the supplier value chain, to understand what it is that they want to say. So some of this is really fundamental communication theory, where it's who's your audience, what is it they need, and then how do you get them to that person. And so this is the case with Circularise being the communication medium, you could say. And so the collaboration between the value chain partners is really what is necessary to make this whole thing work. How do you create this circular value chain, and what's the data necessary? And it's individual. It's some of the players will have the same needs, but it's very individualized based off the position within the value chain and what they want to do with that information.
Yeah, I think one of the key challenges as well that we experience with circular innovation is the scale of which we can actually implement this challenge. So far we've seen a lot of proof of concepts, we've seen a lot of engagement at small scale, but the challenge with the circular economy as well as blockchain, as well as the collaboration that we're all engaging in, is how to actually scale that to a whole value chain. So I would like to also revert to yourself, John, and ask, how do you feel that we can scale this? Because you've talked about the communication flow, but how can you scale that communication?
When you start looking at the whole idea from a design perspective, you realize that there are some problems with it scaling without having something like a middle layer or an open standard protocol. So in order for that to happen, or if that doesn't happen, what you'll have are siloed solutions. And it makes it very difficult to exchange information through that, because each siloed solution will have their own API, their own data sets, their own requirements. So you kind of need to get rid of that and start focusing on what's that glue that keeps everything together, so that when it does scale, you're not stuck in the solution or having to have multiple layers of middleware for one siloed solution to speak to the other. So the key there is to really develop that open standard protocol.
But talking of the different ways here that John's talking about, different silos and the ways of connecting, I'd also like to open the question to Thomas as another material provider. What's the focus for yourself on scaling?
No, very similar. In essence, we are defining and trying to agree on a language to speak on how to be transparent altogether. We are so interconnected, all of us, and we have different types of customers and companies that we are working with. If we work in silos and some cannot join, it becomes very complicated. And so speaking that same language, which we have to agree upon together, I think this is what it's all about and what we're trying to set up.
I mean, I think the point you made is we're all customers and suppliers of each other in this. It's a global challenge. I mean, Mesbah, anything to add from your side, from what Circularise is looking at?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we've seen from raw materials to final products such as Porsche is that the interconnectedness is really, really hard, and there's a lot of complexity in many materials going into many different verticals. So one thing that blockchain specifically has kind of introduced back to the digital innovation space is the concept of open protocols, right? So about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when the internet kind of was nascent, a lot of the innovation was open protocols. We had HTTP and IMAP and other open protocols that allow different commercial solutions, such as Gmail and Outlook, to interoperate. Because email communication is not something you want only for one industry and have a different email provider or a different email client for another customer, right? So that notion kind of got forgotten over the years, and we got the closed siloed solutions dominate the world of Facebook and other closed solutions. But now with the advent of blockchain, we've seen a surge back into open protocols where there is no single entity that controls that whole layer. And because of the advent of blockchains and things like smart contracts, you can do a lot more than what you could previously do with open protocols. So we can basically, as mentioned before, define the language in smart contracts. And this is how we're going to communicate about sustainability from a raw material until every single part. And we're not saying that you have to use this single solution. Companies can choose their own solutions. You can even build your own solutions, such as you can choose your own email client or build your own email client and have that layer of interoperability be a central blockchain that everybody can use and everybody can access, being fully public and permissionless.
Which I think that the fundamentals of blockchain is this decentralized nature. But obviously one of the key challenges on this is the immutable nature of blockchain, that once data is loaded onto a blockchain, it cannot be changed, or it has to also be loaded up in a trusted fashion. I'd like to extend a question to Juergen on this in regards to how do we know if the data is actually trustworthy, because rubbish in, rubbish out, correct?
Thank you. Looking from the perspective of one of the biggest certifiers of that industry, we prove and we generate our set of data by testing the products in our premises and look from the outside literally at these supply chains we were just listening to and hearing about. By that, we can guarantee that the set of data are not influenced by any interest of the partners inside the supply chain, as the nature of the business of being a certified third-party independent entity looking at if properties promised characteristics of products are met. So, but you can only do so much. It means if we are going to a raw material supplier, testing the raw material, the resin, on the promised properties, that works out. Or if we go at the component from the finished product, namely a car from Porsche, and looking if the component behaves as expected and the stages in between, there is a limitation. There's a physical limitation, because otherwise there will be no supply chain. If we test every step and every single item in that supply chain. Having that said, and that's the reason why we're here joining that pilot, we have to think about smart solutions where we transfer the information we get, for example, from the raw material supplier, being populated throughout the whole supply chain without getting that data in any kind, shape or form being manipulated or exchanged. So that is where we would then stand for. We look at this set of data and this set of information flowing through the supply chain by guaranteeing that these data are not being manipulated in any shape or form. By that one, we can leverage our reach, and that would be the benefit of the third-party provider joining that kind of concept. And therefore, the data can be guaranteed being trustworthy.
No, thank you for that answer. And I'd like to extend it to Antoon as well. From the OEM perspective, obviously, data that you're receiving needs to be trustworthy. We've heard the answer on certification, but what would be your answer to this and the value?
I always wanted to follow up straight away, so a very good point. I think from an OEM perspective, it's always, the tricky bit is that we have so many parts and so many suppliers, meaning that theoretically there could be thousands of emails and PDFs and statements in different databases around the company, which is good, that's what we have worked with, which is working. But if you, let's say you want to create something that actually says something about a part and deliver that answer to a customer that maybe is driving his or her vehicle 5 years down the road. At the moment, we might have an answer because the answer is, let's say, lying in the email box of a particular procurement colleague, but it's not accessible. So if this kind of digitalization of that whole process in a format that actually allows access, trustworthy access via UL, for example, but also allows the different providers of the material, like the other people at this table, to actually provide information that they believe is relevant about that particular material. And this, I guess, allows for new use cases that currently are maybe not even explored fully. I mean, one of the examples I always like is, how would it be if we can say this particular button on your dashboard is actually from, let's say, old Coca-Cola bottles, something like that, some kind of story that actually makes it sort of come alive. And to do that, the current situation is not sufficient because that will not really be scalable, will not really be accessible. That being said, there are of course very big challenges of actually making it all happen with the massive amount of parts and materials that are coming into the vehicle. But the principle, I think, is sound.
I mean, just to build on that with Thomas, just as a supplier, what would this mean for yourself? Obviously, you're supplying Porsche, but many other actors within different value chains.
No, exactly. Yeah. For us today, it is, for example, very difficult to valorize the intrinsic value that we are creating when we are greenifying, making more sustainable materials. It typically stops at the next customer. It does not arrive at that place, at the OEM, or that information is not visible enough at that place where it can be truly valorized. And so by these type of solutions, we could achieve that and create those use cases and also create the value for an economy. Because if we can valorize better our green solution, the business case for us becomes easier to work on those type of solutions.
But this is also the value of the data now. Obviously, the actors on this table are not sharing everything openly, completely, transparently, because there's also protective and private data. So, Thomas, to ask on the flip side of that, you know, we've talked about the trustworthiness, but sensitive and private data, if that's held on a blockchain, what happens if that system is hacked? Because that's potentially your USP.
No, exactly. Yeah, I think today, when we want to create transparency, which is absolutely necessary, people tend to ask to us very sensitive information. What's the exact amount of additives that's inside your product? Well, I'm sorry, but that's confidential information. But again, I understand that this is sensible and we need to know that. And so we need to be very mindful on which data that we choose and be able to find a solution that gives us the guarantee that our formulations are not suddenly publicly available, but nevertheless give the required transparency to create new use cases around recyclability, and that's what we are finding in this collaboration and solution.
Yeah. Mesbah, from our side, anything to add from what Circularise is looking into the blockchain system?
Yeah, so I think there's a concept that's really, really important to mention here. First of all, there's nothing on the blockchain to be hacked, so even if you would hack the blockchain, it's a public blockchain, there's nothing to hack. There's not a lot of data you can find there. There is, the title of this panel is Tracing Sustainable Manufacturing Using Blockchain, but actually it should be using blockchain and zero-knowledge proof cryptography. There is a type of cryptography that is kind of emerging in the last decade that is going to be really, really instrumental in a lot of different use cases in society when it comes to privacy and confidentiality. This type of cryptography allows us to make statements about data that we don't even see. We can make statements about data, for example, about the additives made in a specific chemical or product from Domo, without ever having to see that actual data set that's behind it. That data set can be audited by UL, and we can mathematically prove that it has certain characteristics without ever seeing that. And that is done using that cryptography. There's only some sort of like a fingerprint on the blockchain, which doesn't tell you anything, except for whatever statement is being made by Domo is now valid according to the cryptography. So there's a very powerful piece that is not part of the panel's title, but should have been there, that allows us to make private and confidential statements using public blockchains and never risk that data whatsoever.
Yeah, so what we're really trying to do as an organization is provide the infrastructure that allows both the transfer of sensitive information whilst also protecting core value of the organization. So I'd like to ask each of the companies here, not Mesbah because he's the provider of this, but this double-edged side of the transparency on one side but protective information. Thomas, what would you see as the value for you in one sentence? Because then I'd like to make room for the audience to ask questions.
Yeah. Create a business and economy for making more sustainable material.
Create new use cases for data that are currently not possible.
I can come back to you, John, if you need to work
No,
on sentences.
I'm looking at it from I like to say that we essentially are extending our enterprise into the value chain.
So extended enterprise, so full value chain, enterprise level. And Juergen, yourself?
To be the number one partner in safety, science, and trustworthy data.
I know that you didn't ask me this question, but I still want to add something. I think I strongly believe that it is not really worth doing something sustainable if you can't measure it and if you can't prove it. Because we will end up in a world where everybody's claiming and nobody can prove it. So
I think that's a valid addition. I mean, the reason we're all trying to do this in the Greener Manufacturing Show is to actually reduce impact. And if you can't prove it, what's the point of all the effort? But I would really like to open the floor to the audience. Any questions that you have for any of the members here? This is an active collaborative group that's working on these challenges. So these are people who are dealing with the problems of implementation, the challenges, the headaches. If you have any questions, this is a great group to ask. I'm seeing, yeah, please.
With the electrification of vehicles, Porsche included, the current goals, the need for safety and the evaluation of those materials, how do you see this as helping you assure that the products and materials you're testing are going to maintain that, and maybe you could all try to...
Yeah. I'm not sure what's the question heard.
Yeah, so just to give a wrap-up, EV vehicles, polymers, and the need for safety information around these, correct? Anything I've missed there? Okay.
So what I can say is that I think from an EU perspective, there is a lot of activity around battery passport, for example. So there is definitely legislation coming to provide more data on everything to do with electrification. But apart from that, I think a tool, an approach like this, what we're trying out here, is of course, let's say, neutral, is almost agnostic. You can put whatever you want to put on it. Meaning that yes, we can talk about CO2, we can talk about energy, we can talk about recyclability or circular economy features. But I think these kind of critical safety proofs could of course also be captured in a similar way, and they may have to be captured in a similar way, because I can imagine starting with the battery passport. I mean, at the moment it's all about what's the provenance of the material going into the battery. Next step up is, of course, what happens during recycling. You want to recycle it. You want to know exactly what went in, so you can repackage these batteries for other purposes. So you have all kind of use cases that basically all have the same issue. You want to know where something is coming from. You want to know that what you see in data is true and not tampered with. That could also definitely go for safety. So I would say that's definitely a very important point. I personally don't really know what's happening currently at EU regulatory level around that, but I can fully imagine that to be part of that kind of push.
Would anyone else like to contribute an answer to that?
Anyone with batteries?
It's also one of our initial use cases when we started working with Circularise was something on QA. And that goes back, I mean, someone Antoon said it, as far as the visibility along the value chains. If there is a breakdown, you're able to trace it back and say, okay, well, this is the problem. If there is a certification, safety certification associated with that during that process, then you can really pinpoint, well, that's the problem. This was the problem with the certification or the non-certification. So there is, again, there's many use cases for this visibility, and that's just another one of them.
So on one side it's the transparency and the value capture, on the other it's the mitigating of risk and or at least being able to protect yourself against that. Any other questions from the audience? Anything that didn't make sense? Are we talking things that are completely going over your head, or is it just too late in the day and we're all tired and we want to head for a drink? Sure.
Yeah, let me ask a question. I mean,
you were talking about materials, I think, in the existing supply chain and validating those. But if I'm looking for a sustainable alternative for sustainable material, actually it's quite difficult to know what's out there. I mean, we understand waste from households quite well, but we don't understand industrial wastes. So how could you build a system that allows me, as a company or as an academic, to actually understand what are the challenges that need to be addressed and how do you get hold of these materials?
So the supply versus demand and even the knowledge around what materials are available. Yeah, I would like to go for one of the base material providers, either Thomas or John. Would you have a question, an answer to this question?
I can give you a first answer. I think it is indeed these days very challenging for all material suppliers to find circular solutions. So the offering that is out there is limited. Can be found through the traditional ways, I would say. We try to be as explicit as possible on those solutions that we have, but it will be on those typical platforms that exist, like UL, for example, where you can indeed find a more sustainable material. So maybe it's a good one also for UL to answer, to see how they can make more obvious what are the green materials on their platforms.
No, absolutely, happy to chime in there. From the fundamental understanding of the materials we test, there is literally no limit. We have I state every time, all the materials which are on the planet went once to one of our labs. So, and the point is now, how do we combine these data? We have that knowledge in-house, but it's every time point to point. Somebody comes, we test, give it back. Somebody comes, we test, give it back. So, and the combination of it and the analytics behind, that is the core question. How do we get these data together and how do we make a model out of it? Which we haven't addressed so far as well. That's why we are so interested in looking into it. Because that point-to-point has a physical end on leveraging. Now when we come into composition of materials coming out of different sources, there is not a limitation that we cannot quantify what it is, where it comes from, which properties, etc. The question is how do you combine it and then go back to the supply chain and back to the component, back to the product, and vice versa. It's all about how do we trace it and how do we get it together. Not that we, at any point in time, at any point in the supply chain, would be able to determine the properties. You give us any kind of stuff, we scratch it and we make a fingerprint out of it, and we know most likely what's in there. Or we compare it with the data we already have and then get a likelihood that we hit the material very, very close. Does it make sense? Does that answer your question?
Because I was actually going to build on that, because you mentioned new materials that come into the chain. Obviously, from a design point of view, you get a brief, so you have the designer, you've got to try and find the material. But obviously the idea of a circular economy process, and Juergen touched on it, the full bringing that material back in. Does anyone have an example that they've looked at, or a theory idea where they're thinking this would be a space to work on? See, Antoon, you're looking.
Well, I was just thinking about that question because, in a way, in automotive, it's very hard to use materials that you don't really know the background of. Meaning that if there would be more clarity on what a particular material has gone through during its lifetime, we might find different ways to integrate. Let's say, take materials back in, but if there's no knowledge, no data, no proof, then, for example, around safety and security, there are lots of issues. So I think it kind of, if there's a data basis that starts to grow, then actually that could be very beneficial to actually start fueling this circular economy approach.
And maybe give a very practical example. About 5 years ago, we went to recycling facilities in Europe that were recycling flat screen monitors. And they were taking about 3 to 4 minutes for each unit to disassemble by hands and screwdrivers and hammers, because they were identifying certain additives and chemicals and flame retardants. And oftentimes it was just guesswork. There was a guy working there for a decade, and he could almost see them from the outside. But it still took them a long time. Obviously, they can't just put old flat screen monitors containing mercury backlight into the shredding process, and they contaminate everything. So we work with them on a very small scale pilot to see from an R&D perspective what's going to happen if you give them the right data. And what if we would live in a world where all these end-of-life flat screen monitors would contain all the data that they would require? And within about 6 hours of giving them that data and implementing that into their operations, they could sort their products about 3 to 4 times faster, and the quality of the output was drastically higher, right? So that's just after 6 hours, right? So imagine having a world where all this data is there, attached to physical products, and the amount of innovation that will spur in circular economy thinking.
We've officially come to the end of the time, or at least that's what my timer is saying. I don't know if there's any one question or thought that someone wants to put to the panel. I see a hand go up. So, do we have time for one last? I believe so. Yes. Okay. Perfect.
Thank you. I would like to ask maybe a little bit different question, because the idea of tracking the sustainable composition of the product is really fascinating. But because you're also in the blockchain industry, I'm curious. Do you think you and you Mesbah and companies from the industry about is there a possibility to transfer the value of being a circular product or bio-based product directly to the customer using the blockchain? Because, well, being involved in the bio-based solutions, it's always a question who is going to pay the premium, and nobody can answer that question. But maybe blockchain can be a solution when a consumer directly will decide if he's willing to pay, buying a Porsche car, but additionally for sustainability composition of that car.
Great question. We can give an answer from our side, which is that we're trying to work collaboratively across the value chain, so it's a shared activity. But I would also go towards Antoon and John and also Thomas. Antoon, you have a very direct use case that you're thinking about and working and exploring.
Yeah. So what we have been doing in the pilot project so far is really looking at, first of all, who are all the different stakeholders and how can we add value to these stakeholders, so both internally and externally, and that includes the end customer. And we know that there is an interest to know more about the vehicle, where the parts are coming from, what's going in it. So that would allow then potentially to find ways to really monetize that, right? So if someone has a particular interest in a particular material, you mentioned biodegradable, that could allow for, let's say, an upselling approach. That's the one side of it. On the other side, that only works if the whole supply chain, of course, collaborates with it, and actually then the provider of the material also has an upside. So that's coming back to it has to be something that everyone benefits from, otherwise it won't work. Because the scale is too big. And I think that's the tricky bit, is how to manage that, right? How to make that first step. And I think someone has to do it, and then more will follow. But then the how is the big question. And I see a lot of hesitation, let's say, in the industry, because everyone's looking to the left and to the right, like who's going to start. And maybe, this is just my personal reflection on today, it could be that automotive is too complex to actually be the first one. You might need to have a very simple case first, and another simple case, another simple case, another simple case, till there is enough, let's say, of a basis to actually make it into the more complex cases. Meaning, for us, maybe just taking one product, one part, or maybe just looking for more specific other markets where this is easy to implement and then be a fast follower.
Thomas?
Like the question, I think we all have to realize that having data attached basically to materials end of life, once you have that, it dramatically increases the rest value of that part, final thing, because you know you can do more with it, and that's what we're trying to achieve in essence. Imagine a car where you know everything about. It's probably not so wise then to scrap it, because you know very well where all the valuable stuff is and you can actually get it out. And so the intrinsic value, end of life, becomes much higher if we start tracing and tracking all those materials, parts and things that we are doing today. So intrinsically creating that circular economy much easier. And that is possible thanks to blockchain and doing it decentralized.
I would just make my final point on the fact that from a circular business model case, a business model construct is a company perspective. A circular business model by its design is an ecosystem perspective, so therefore it has to be shared. And I think I'm being called time. So that's our panel. Thank you very much for sticking around, and thank you for the engaging questions.